Welcome back, everybody. We are now at the part of our meeting where we're going to spend some time reflecting on what we just heard about the comparative effectiveness and the comparative value of tolebrutinib. We're going to hit on a lot of the themes that we've already heard today. We're going to touch on the liver toxicity issue. We're going to talk about place in therapy and appropriate patients. We're going to then shift to talk a little bit about what this means for coverage policy. How are payers and policymakers going to take this information and design coverage policies that support fair price and fair access for patients? We're going to spend some time talking about future research needs. That came through already today. And then we're going to talk about some of the calls to action that we'd like to see from all of the participants in the system. I'm Sarah Emond. I'm the president and CEO. It is an absolute pleasure to be with this esteemed panel today. A few of our panel members you have already met, and I don't think we have their thank you. We're going to just let each of our panel members introduce themselves. If there's any updates to the conflicts of interest that are listed here, please provide that to the team. And then we're going to get into our discussion. Rob, can I ask you to go first, please? Looking for Rob.
Sorry, guys, I just hopped back on.
That's great. Could you just introduce yourself for those who are just joining this part of the meeting?
Still sorry. Rob Bermel, a neurologist and director of the Mellon Center for MS at Cleveland Clinic. No additional disclosures beyond what's on the screen.
Thank you so much, Rob. And Kathy. Kathy Costello, can you say a quick hello and reintroduce yourself? No worries.
And I am interim CEO for the Consortium of MS Centers and the International Organization of MS Nurses, and also president of the Multiple Sclerosis Coalition. And I have no additional conflicts to report.
Thank you. Aaron, thanks for being here. Why don't you say hello?
Sure. Hey, my name is Aaron Dush. I'm a clinical pharmacist for United Healthcare, and I have no other further conflicts of interest.
Thank you. Lisa, my deep thanks for coming from Sanofi.
Sure, my pleasure. Lisa Farnett, I am Global Medical Director with Sanofi and the Global Medical Lead for tolebrutinib, and a full-time employee of Sanofi.
Thank you so much. Nancy.
Hi, I am a retired board-certified healthcare chaplain, and I have no conflicts to report.
And a patient living with SPMS.
That too.
Ellen.
Hi, Ellen Mowry. I'm a neurologist and researcher at Johns Hopkins University. In addition to what's reported there, I receive royalties for editorial duties from UpToDate.
Thank you, Ellen. And Jeff.
Oh, hello, everyone. I'm Jeff White. I'm the Staff Vice President of Clinical Pharmacy Services for CarolinaRx for the Pharmacy Department for Elevance Health, and I have no conflict of interest to report.
Wonderful. So as we take down this slide so that we can all see each other better for this discussion, I will warn everyone that I have pages of notes. As I was listening to the meeting today and preparing for this, it's really such an interesting moment to be able to reflect on a new treatment, potentially, for a particular condition that hasn't had an approved treatment before, if we're thinking of sort of the non-active SPMS population. But it comes with a lot of questions about how we think about affordability and access, the right patient population. So we're going to dive right in. The format today is a couple of themes that I want to touch on, get reactions from all of the different perspectives. I'll tell my fellow panelists now that at the end of this, you get a call to action. You get to tell somebody in the system to do something, very nicely, of course. But start thinking about that now. What would it be that you would want to see change, that you would want to see happen in regards to really having a system that's supporting affordable access to these new medicines? We really like to think about the health equity question first so that we don't lose the possibility of highlighting something from an equity perspective that's really important as we're thinking about this. When we talk about previous reviews that we've done, we've hit on things like cost sharing, making sure that's not a big problem for a population, or rural versus urban. What are we doing to making sure that we've got equitable access across different populations? So I'd like to go around the room and see what are we thinking about the equity issues that should be top of mind as we think about policy development in this disease area for this particular drug. Broadly for MS is also okay. And this have in our heads the reflection of the relevance of the vote that our CPAC just took on the racial and ethnic populations and the significance there that they saw, knowing that we have some clinical differences from a racial and ethnic perspective. So Kathy, I'm going to put you on the spot first. I know. That's what you get for having contributed so wonderfully today. I just wonder if, and especially as your perspective as a registered MS nurse, like you have been working in this and you've seen the evolution of some of these health equity issues. What's top of mind for you as you think about how we manage any health equity issues with this new medicine?
Yeah, so I think when we think about health equity, I think about access and I think about having people having the same opportunities for access. And that simply doesn't exist in the US for a variety of reasons. Some is location, not only of the person, but also of the care
Right.
and the expertise around that care. And these are big questions that I don't think that we're going to come up with the answers to today. I'd love to, but I don't think that that's possible. But I do think that those are some drivers. And as we know that healthcare disparities, and we know that there are a number of social drivers, educational drivers, there's many things that contribute to inequities. But I think location and expertise, distance, expertise in the provider are certainly drivers to having inequitable care. I also think that people with MS have varying degrees of knowledge about their condition and the potential risks in choosing not to be on treatment, for example, not following up, not being monitored. I think that there's a knowledge gap that though we try very hard to close, it continues to exist. And so I think that there are drivers to inequities coming from a variety of places. One could also say cost, depending on what someone's payer situation is. Cost is certainly can be a driver of inequity. And I think too that there's also inherent bias in healthcare providers, and that can also be a driver in inequities in choosing therapies and making prescriptive decisions. There's probably
Kathy,
more, but that's a good start.
I know. Well, there's one thing I'm going to pull through that you talked about earlier today that I wrote down. I wanted to make sure, and I hope I'm not stealing the answer from some of your co-panelists as they were thinking about how they would answer this question. But how struck I was by the comment that we're not even sure we're giving equitable access to best supportive care, let alone access to a new therapy that may be expensive, that might have high cost sharing. So do you want to just highlight that for a moment about what you've seen?
For sure. And I think it's going to come from the exact same places that I just mentioned. So, is the expertise in the community such that there's a belief that supportive care is beneficial? Are rehabilitation strategies beneficial, and do they show improvements, stabilization, improved quality of life? There are still people who believe that that's not true. Are those therapists available to someone? You know, when someone has MS, most physical therapists provide orthopedic care, right? So recovery from injuries, for example, and not as many have expertise in neurological care. They're not on every corner. And so just saying someone goes to therapy does not translate into a benefit from that. And I think too, when we consider lifestyle, when we consider comorbid conditions, all of these different aspects of someone's life are drivers of worsening, and they're not always attended to. They're not attended to for, again, those variety of reasons. Is it the social consequences? Is it education? Is it location? Is it provider expertise? Is it knowledge of the person? Yes, to all of them. But I do not believe that people receive best supportive care everywhere in this country. I would argue it's I don't have data to support this, but based on personal experience of what I've seen, I think that it's pretty low.
I appreciate that. It's something we're going to highlight in our policy recommendations, that the system has a responsibility not only to make access to this new therapy affordable and accessible for patients, but also all of the other things. We don't want to lose sight of that. We had a policy roundtable talking about COPD. We spent a lot of time talking about access to oxygen, not the new therapy. And so this, I think, it falls into that category. Nancy, is there anything from your perspective, as you've navigated the system as a patient with MS, that you've seen sort of from an equity of access perspective that you want to add to this?
I think there's two things. Well, the first thing that comes to mind, and that's because it affects, obviously, it's what affects me that comes to mind first. I think the age factor is huge
Yes.
because a lot of us who, I was with a neurologist for years who just kept telling me your MRIs are fine, nothing's changing. And I would go in and say, but this is getting worse. And he's like, no, you're fine. So it took a long time to get to the secondary progressive, to have somebody actually speak. Yeah, you're right. You are getting worse. But things change once you hit Medicare age
Yeah.
about what you can get, what kind of pharmaceutical assistance you can get, how much you have to pay out of pocket for a Med D plan. If you can't find some, I'm very fortunate that the healthcare system, that the academic system I work in, actually has their own neurological specialty pharmacists who do all of the advocating and go through digging all of the stuff so
Right.
that I can still get my drugs.
Right.
Because there's no way that I could pay what the cheapest Med D plan would have me pay out of pocket for my DMT, $95,000 a year, which is a lot more than my Social Security check is. So if I wanted to live on the street, I could get a DMT. One or the other, right? So I think the age thing is probably the biggest thing, and how the regulations go. Also, I think how much time physicians have to talk about what the resources are for people, or
Right.
if they have an office where they have maybe a social worker or a nurse practitioner who can sit down with you and double check what kind of things these are the resources, or maybe we can get you into therapy, or maybe we can do this. Physicians are pushed so hard, a lot on payer requirements to get us in and get us out, that it's a miracle that they even listen to us at all. So unless you're your own advocate or you have people who are fighting for you, I think it's really hard to get access to all of those extra things that could make the simple things that could make your quality of life better. That if somebody doesn't mention it, you don't know. You don't know what you don't know. So,
Nancy, thank you. And I think that we can all understand that there's also a bit of privilege that happens when you're in a system that has a navigator that can help you, and not everyone has access to that type of comprehensive support, and that's an area that we can work on. I love the mention of Medicare. This is going to come up today because we know that secondary progressive, right, is happening later in life, and that transition from commercial to Medicare, and the ways that we can make that as seamless as possible. I cannot help but mention there is now a $2,000 out-of-pocket maximum for drugs in Medicare, and you can pay over time. And let's celebrate that at least something happened in that regard that I think is quite meaningful to a lot of patients with expensive medicines. And so just a little celebration of that. All right, I want to shift to, well, Rob, you had your hand up, and I was gonna go to the clinical experts next, but from your perspective and the number of patients that you see, what equity issues should we try to highlight in our report?
No, it gets no better from hearing it directly from someone like Nancy, who spoke, I think, very well to some of the issues. The geographic issue is very real. We've done some work at our center showing that a very high percentage of the U.S. population does not have an MS center within 60 miles. And I think that geographic reality is, even if you are near one, sometimes the wait is 6 months or longer to even get into one.
Right.
I do think that also MS is a chronic disease. A lot of our expectations around treatments are built into resolving a condition or improving a condition. I'll take physical therapy, for instance. Oftentimes a patient on Medicare will have very limited resources for physical therapy, or if on private insurance, an expectation for improvement is not met, the resource will be denied, when
Yep.
really patients with MS need something like physical therapy as a maintenance therapy just to maintain or slow the progression.
As someone who spent a year in physical therapy after breaking their leg skiing, that bar was there too. And so I thank you for raising that. I think that's something that we can highlight for coverage policies around PT that can address this nuance for sort of maintenance and not necessarily showing improvement. Thank you, Rob. Ellen, I'll go to you next in terms of the patients that you serve. Any health equity issues that you want to make sure we address?
I mean, they are as innumerable as the inequity issues are at scale for so many issues, and really horrifying. I would really focus a little bit more though in thinking about the particular medication as a sort of a case study for like a lot of different ways in which inequities in completing this monitoring program might occur. First, you need to actually have a physician who knows enough about MS and these nuances that everyone on the panel has tried to struggle to understand. What is relapsing, non-relapsing, active, non-active? Is your inactive MS because of your age and that you're just progressing, or is it because you're on a disease modifying therapy? Because you're going to have to come off of that therapy to come onto this one, right? And is that going to be a better solution for you than it is to stay on the therapy you're on? So access to somebody like that who can help. Then there's the safety monitoring that we talked about. Different payers actually allow people different degrees of flexibility as to where they can get their safety labs even monitored. So I can literally do labs for some of my patients, and my experience is that this is not equitable along racial lines. I can get safety labs for some of my patients in my clinic. They can come to my clinic for their 6-month appointment. They can get labs on the way out and they are cleared for the next 6 months. And others are required to go to an outside facility that usually requires them to make an appointment. And essentially in a high traffic area, it means a 3-hour experience to make the appointment, get to the appointment, wait for the labs, get the labs, and get out, right? So who's going to pay for the transportation to the labs? Never mind the copay costs. And for people who are living with greater amounts of disability, whether it's physical or cognitive fatigue, that's a very high burden. I think there are a lot of concerns related to the topic at hand today, as well as more broadly.
Ellen, thank you for the specific equity issues that we'll want to highlight about what might be, and we expect will be a monitoring requirement for this therapy that offers its own equity issues. Lisa, thank you so much for being here. It's also an opportunity for me to thank Sanofi for their engagement in this entire review. You participated in our in-confidence data submission, which we really appreciate because that improved our model. What equity issues are you tracking from an industry perspective? As you see these issues and you think about your role as a manufacturer, what's top of mind for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think we, as a company, we have a global commitment to promoting access, and we have a lot of initiatives around this type of thing. And as a personal issue as well. I mean, it's heartbreaking if you have a patient, or you have a drug that could be transformative for a patient and they couldn't get it. That would be that would be awful, right? So we have a lot of initiatives here from a Sanofi perspective in terms of improving access, looking at underserved populations, that kind of thing. And I would just say that we've moved in the rankings for access to medicines index. We've moved from 8th to 3rd. So we've done some good things in this area, and we're committed to promoting access for all patients.
Lisa, thank you. So Erin and Jeff, now turning to you with understanding, I think for both of you, your purview is really on the drug side, but we've already touched on some of the things like PT and otherwise, lab monitoring. Just as you're thinking about ultimate coverage policies for this and things like that, how are you making considerations of health equity and access kind of be top of mind as you develop those policies? Jeff, let me start with you.
Sure, thank you, Sarah, and it's glad to be here. And when we think about the pharmacy world and evidence and providing access to care, there are three things that we're really trying to accomplish. The first and foremost is improving health. That's what it's all about as healthcare professionals, improving health of our members, improving the health of patients. And we do this by using evidence-based medicine, understanding the science, the data behind it. So important, it's so critical. And we're talking about high quality evidence, not just any study that you see in the web or any study that's even published. It could be in a journal article. Doesn't mean that it's not unbiased, and it has to be understood and reviewed and analyzed carefully to understand the true benefits and harms. The reason we do that is we want to identify which of those drugs are clinically superior, which drugs are clinically inferior, to promote those clinically superior drugs and align use of those drugs where there's evidence of clinical benefit to maximize the benefit to the patient. It's ultimately what it's all about. And if we do that, if we're improving health, we should be lowering total cost of care, which improves access for everybody when we're lowering total cost of care. And we want to provide an outstanding experience for patients and prescribers, and doing all that and doing it well. How that ties into equity and how to provide equitable care. It's important to do this consistently across all drugs, all therapeutic categories, all patient types, whether it's commercial, Medicare, Medicaid, being consistent and doing that overall. It's also helpful to have evidence that includes broad populations. Sometimes evidence can be narrow to certain population types, and then you have to kind of make an extrapolation of that. And really just thinking from a holistic perspective, provide the best care we can for everybody and treating everybody fairly and equally. So, yeah, thank you. And Aaron?
Jeff,
yeah.
No, Jeff, I really appreciate one of the things that I just wrote down and want to make sure we highlight. We see this when we've done our own analyses of coverage policies, the differences across lines of business can itself be an equity issue, right? Like and I know there's different regulations in different lines of business, whether commercial versus Medicare versus Medicaid, but I appreciate that you brought that up. So yeah, Aaron, over to you for things that are kind of on your radar as you're thinking about the equity of access issues here.
Sure, thanks. And I mean, I think everybody had really great points, and I don't know how much to add on to that. That's everything that you need to consider. But as far as policy points and equity, I think that keeping it patient-centric, being straightforward with what what is in the policy, evidence-based, like Jeff said, that's what we're going by. Is it guideline based? Is it what was in the studies? What patients need to get this? Not make it that part difficult. The monitoring and stuff is going to unfortunately fall on the patient or the caregiver, what that falls to, but not making, anything added that, we're going to require, because that's more, the safety and clinical, and that's up to the, the clinical providers to guide that, but, making sure that the right patient has access and, the barriers are minimal.
Thanks, Aaron. And one thing for me in this space is there's a lot of friction. Right. And so we can feel friction between a provider and a plan, between a patient and a plan, between a patient and their provider. Right. So that friction can exist. And so the commitment we can all make to look for opportunities to sort of de-escalate that friction will have follow-on consequences for improving equity issues. Right. Because it's often a position of privilege that allows you to navigate the friction. Right. So I think that we've all sort of experienced that. So thank you for this conversation. I think we can definitely have a lot of these themes pull through. I'd like to next shift for some reflections on what we heard from our independent panel, our CTAF today, on the votes, on some of the questions around comparative clinical effectiveness and then the benefits beyond health. I'd like to start with the clinical experts. The panel voted 12-1 that the evidence was not adequate to show that there was a net health benefit with this therapy. We heard a lot of the conversation today about the data, some data that we wish we had that we didn't. But Ellen and Rob, as you're thinking about this in practice, were you surprised by that vote? Did that track with how you're thinking about things? Just let me put Ellen on the spot first for some reactions to the votes today.
I'm not really surprised. I mean, caring for people with MS is nuanced, and we haven't been provided with sufficient data about performance in subgroups to really help us interpret the nuance of the top line results. And so I think that when the question is like, you know, worded as it is, you can't in good conscience say, oh yeah, everything's, you know, flat, because there is nuance there, and we know that it's available. We know that those subgroup analyses probably have been done and are being prepared to share, but it'd be very hard to make a blanket statement at this time. And so I'm not really that surprised.
Right.
We need more data about the performance in subgroups. And, you know, when we think about precision medicine and treating every person as an individual, we're trying to understand, where are the subgroups? How do they behave differently? And how do those subgroups, you know, what kind of specific treatment does one subgroup need compared to another? And we haven't seen the data yet for this product.
And I appreciate that point. It's something that the themes that come through in a lot of ICER reviews is that we're looking at data sets that are averages for whole populations, and we often don't have the information that we need to make that personalized medicine decision. So a call for that information to continue to be what we produce so we can make more patient-centered decisions on treatment. Rob, anything to add there on the reflections on the votes today?
In reflecting about it, I mean, I have to put it in perspective as also, I think this is we're at a very unique milestone in the progressive MS journey where there's a new mechanism of action that has had a positive top-line trial results in an area of the disease that's been kind of historically intractable. And I think it's a milestone on a long journey, and totally agree with Ellen. We absolutely need more data to guide, our choices that we make in clinic. I absolutely believe that patient selection, in a world where we have different options for patients with progressive MS, many of whom may be best served on our current high efficacy disease modifying therapies, some of whom may be right for a therapy like this, some of whom may be right for the current standard of care, and if we could get them excellent PT and rehab care and things like that, may be best off. But we do need additional data to help guide those choices in the selection of our patients.
Thank you, Rob. Nancy, Kathy, anything you'd like to add as reflections as you heard the discussion on the evidence and the votes and where we landed? Kathy?
Oh, yeah, so thanks. I think it's unfortunate. It's unfortunate that we don't have enough information to really make an informed decision. And I think not just informed decision, but a decision we can feel confident in. I don't think anyone felt confident even saying no, because you're only saying no because you don't have enough data to say yes, right? So, and that's an unfortunate thing. Now, we always tend to want data, and even when we get a lot of data, we even want more data, and that's just who we are, I think. But here, I think we are lacking. We have these, this very top line, reduction in or delaying disability, which could be really profound, right? But we need to know a little bit more to really understand how profound is this. I agree with Rob in that, we are really on the cusp, and maybe beyond the cusp, of looking at this disease completely differently. And now we have the potential for a treatment that also looks at this completely differently. And I would argue that in our world of unknowns, which are pretty big, that we don't have a complete handle on where this is going. We know that we will start to see new disease phenotypes. And will it even be phenotypes, or will it just be one disease and then we see it on a timeline trajectory, which will change how we look at treatment? And I think for the payers, I feel bad, when a drug like this does get approved, if it's approved before we have that information and that level of understanding, making a decision is going to be very challenging. So I think that the more information we have in a variety of areas, certainly on the drug, no doubt, but also about MS in general and how we're going to be looking at this disease are going to be really pretty important in all of our decision making.
We just hit a milestone as an ICER policy roundtable where a patient expressed empathy for the difficulty that payers will be in trying to navigate this. Kathy, thank you for that milestone. But you're not wrong, right? Like these are really hard decisions to make about balancing access and affordability. Nancy, quickly to you, something you said earlier today really struck me. When we were talking about the caregiver impact question, and not to jump too much ahead, but you said, listen, maintaining my current level of disability is not what I'm after. I'm after reversing, or that's where I'd see real benefit. So do you want to share a little bit about sort of how you were thinking about the outcomes that we talked about today and how they're meaningful or not to you as you think about your disease journey?
For me, I know this is progressive, right? So if you can stop, I don't care about I mean, I'm haven't had a relapse in several years, but I get worse. If you could just stop me from getting worse, if next month I was like I am this month, I'd be thrilled.
Great.
It would make a huge difference in my quality of life. So that to me is important. And I wanted to add one more thing about the insurance piece, and this is nothing to do with current company present because I haven't any experience with your company. But as to the comment about Medicare and the $2,000 cap, that applies to formulary drugs. And I can tell you when I had to make the decision at the beginning of this year about whether I was going to stay on my husband's commercial or go with a Med D plan, nobody had the drug that I've been taking for over 20 years on their
Part D. Yeah. Yeah.
And formularies,
Thank you. Yeah.
formularies change like that. And I agree. You cannot expect insurers to pick up the whole piece.
Yeah.
It's a huge amount with chronic disease. I get that. So there has to be something that we.
Well, I appreciate being corrected on that. You are correct that the 2,000 out-of-pocket cap is just on Part D. And if your drug that you're taking is not even on the formulary, then that cap is no help to you. And then if you're getting an infused drug and you're on Part B, we still have some stuff to do there with how we're thinking about cost sharing and the co-insurance that's there on Medicare. Thank you for raising that. Lisa, before we sort of turn away, I think that, I'm hearing a couple of things here. I think we want more data. I'm going to assume you would like to be able to give us more data and that there's some limitations perhaps on why we're still wanting. Do you want to share a little bit educationally here about why we find ourselves in this position?
Yeah, so first of all, we're super excited to share the data that we have. And I would love to be able to share a lot more with you today, but these things take a little bit of time to go. And right now we have a lot of data that's embargoed, but I would just remind this group that this drug, we just presented the top line results or the main results 8 months ago. It's, and then we put out the manuscripts in April, which you have the manuscript. So we had to work on that. And they did not allow a lot of this subgroup analysis to be put into the manuscript. So the way that it works for us is that we need to get it out in the public before we can really talk about it. And so the next deadline, the deadlines are really October and May for the most part, right? So the deadline for AAN, which you guys are familiar with, is actually in October and the meeting is in April. So there's a big lag time between when we can actually submit and get these data out, right? So we submitted a packet of data for ECTRIMS, which is the deadline was in May. So we hit that deadline. We submitted a packet of data. So you will see some more data coming, but it's punctuated out with the way that these things have to kind of roll out. So right now we're embargoed. We can't talk about it, but I'm super excited for you guys to be able to see it. I think it'll really be helpful to you when you see that data and, at the time of approval as well. It'll be certainly really, really interesting to have those conversations.
Lisa, thank you for that. We understand. I worked in investor relations for 10 years for biopharmaceutical companies. What you didn't say, but you kind of hinted at, was there's also not the ability to say much to just one crowd. You have to make it publicly available all at the same time, so your investors see it and the public sees it. I think there's an opportunity here for us to be thinking about ways that the system could be a little bit better. So I understand the desire to present at the big meetings, to publish in the big journals. But as payers, patients, and clinicians are faced with decisions that they need to start making right when it gets approved, that's gonna create tension for wanting it. So I think we can own that there might be other avenues and ways to get some of the information out where you can still preserve the big bang that you want at those meetings and in those journal publications. Ellen, to you, please.
Yeah, I was going to just say the same thing as a clinician, and as somebody who luckily has had, a bit of training in epidemiology and thinking about subgroups and, data at the group level versus at the individual level. I feel fortunate to be able to dig through what gets put out at meetings and in publications and kind of rapidly synthesize what the strength of the evidence is and what the gaps are. But I think some of these issues take time to disseminate and for people to really appreciate the nuance of how to interpret data. And there's a struggle in academia for sure to, are you going to get publications and are you going to get posters and things like that? But I would argue on the side of, like new medications coming on board, like those shouldn't be the drivers, in my opinion, of when data are released that are relevant to decision making, because there's a lot of work that could be going on between now and, a potential approval that would help clinicians and people with MS best understand how to interpret the data so that, if an approval occurs, they can use the best shared decision making to try to apply the results to their own unique situation.
Ellen, thank you for saying it a lot better than I did. I appreciate that perspective. I want to shift now to some of the, when I did my opening for those who watched, we talk a lot about how there are things that are typically measured in a cost effectiveness model and in a comparative effectiveness review that are easy-ish to measure. And then there are these other things that are harder to measure that are still important. So we took a few votes today on these other benefits and special ethical priorities. Some of them kind of landed where I expected, right? So we had a strongly agree sort of uniformly on there's a significant unmet need here. There is no approved therapy, at least for the non-active SPMS category, and this would mark an incredible change to that paradigm where there's nothing. So that unmet need, we all acknowledge. I will say the racial ethnic question, I'd love to unpack a little bit. And we sort of talked about this as a condition of significant importance to racial and ethnic groups. And I will admit that early in my journey, I have a family member with MS. I was under the impression this is something that happens to white women. And I really appreciated how we teased out what we're learning about the differential impact. It can actually be worse in subpopulations. So just to the clinical experts, just for sort of, again, the educational piece here, our panel agrees, strongly agree that this is of a significant interest. Anything you would like to add for that piece of things, the sort of racial and ethnic piece? Bob, can I go to you first? Excuse me, Rob. Sorry about that.
No, you're good. So I think, in short, it's something that we need to pay more attention to, and it needs further study. Yeah. I was really quite excited about a trial that was done in MS called the CHIMES trial by a different company. It was a phase 4 study of patients with Black and Latinx background, and really studied the disease and the behavior of the treatments and the outcomes of the treatments in depth. And I think those sorts of, it actually gained a ton of traction in the MS physician community, I think. And those sorts of, in addition to obviously including, making efforts to include even more patients of diversity into core trials, those sorts of phase 4 studies to further study how these drugs behave in subgroups, I think is exactly the right way to go, and I'd like to see more of it.
Thank you, Rob. Ellen, anything from your perspective there?
Yeah, I agree. And I would just echo that I think it's incumbent upon us as through all of the hats that we wear as human beings on this planet, as you know, the various ways we touch on this system, that we really have to put our money where our mouths are in terms of ensuring there's good representation in clinical trials. For example, a trial I run and one that's run out of Cleveland Clinic has a much more representative population. We're around 19%, for example, Black or African American in those trials. Whereas we're still seeing that these large platform trials are not including minoritized groups. The people we serve, from Dr. Langergold's own work, demonstrates that in the US, Black or African American women are the highest incidence group of MS. And they notice that they're not being included in these clinical trials. We have to do better. It makes a huge difference for people to feel included, to know that medications have been studied across intersectional identities with which people, relate to.
Yeah, thank you, Ellen. And we have our clinical trial diversity tool that we bring to just, again, more educational and not meant to be like we're not trying to, beat anybody up by saying like you didn't do a good job. From my conversations, this is a shared goal across the ecosystem, and are significant challenges to meeting it. And so I like how you framed it, Ellen, that like, let's all bring our best human selves to this, so that we're thinking about ways to increase the diversity in the clinical trials, to identify pockets of disease prevalence that we might have missed because of our own biases and blind spots. And I think that we can definitely include this among our future research needs. Kathy, please go ahead.
Thanks. So I was just thinking about this and how much effort the advocacy organizations are trying to put into this particular issue. I think it's recognized by everyone in the MS community. And interestingly enough, with the Chimes trial, it was a very dedicated trial, right? So you were only looking for a certain population of people, and gosh darn it, didn't we fill that trial and get amazing information? Yet when we go back to our trials that are all comers, if you will, it didn't happen. It didn't happen. I think that I can't unpack everything that could have gone into why that happened, but I'm sure that if we took the time to look at it, there's a variety of reasons. You've mentioned some of them, our own inherent biases, where the trials are taking place, what the population there looks like. I mean, it could go on and on. But I think that understanding the barriers to participation and encouraging people to consider that a clinical trial, and why would you not, the kinds of objective information to help people make decisions, I think is incumbent in a way on everyone, but certainly on the advocacy organizations to try and get that information out to their constituencies.
The point I take from that, many points from that, well said, Kathy, is also the intentionality, right? So that the Chime trial was achieved because it had the intention of doing so. And I think that's an important lesson. Ellen, and then Lisa, I'm teeing you up to just talk a little bit next about how you guys approach this issue of diversity in the trials. Go ahead, Ellen.
Yeah, one thing I would just like to reflect on is that, participating in a trial actually is a treatment benefit. It's not something we can state, but if you're enrolled in a clinical trial, you are getting much more handholding in your clinical care. You have kind of direct access to the back office. There is a lot of benefit. And in the cancer literature, for example, it's demonstrated that trial participants are actually more likely to survive longer than non-participants.
Even if they were randomized, probably, right?
Even the lack of intentionality towards making trials more representative is in itself a form of inequity. So yeah.
Thank you. Lisa, what do you want to share about this issue and how it was approached from the Sanofi perspective in terms of diversity in the patient population?
Yeah, I mean, this is something we're dedicated to at Sanofi. We have a whole division dedicated to increasing the diversity in the clinical trials. We work with advocacy groups to really advocate, to really get that diversity into the trials. I think it's very well known across the community that this is a big problem for everybody right now, and we need to get more diversity in the clinical trials. So it's a huge focus for us to do that.
Lisa, anything that you've learned that you want to kind of share, either that went well or didn't, or where there have been successes or opportunities for doing it better?
Nothing that really kind of comes off the top of my head. I think really just the collaboration with the community is just really key.
That's great. Yeah, partnerships is one thing that I have heard. You know, some of these issues come from a lack of trust among communities, and partnerships can help rebuild trust. And I know that that's something that a lot of organizations are trying. That's great. All right, so now we're going to shift. We're going to get a little nitty gritty here. Now we want to start talking about what a coverage policy might look like for this new medicine. So for this part of the conversation, we're going to assume that this gets approved. We're going to acknowledge we don't know what the label would be. It might be for active and non-active. It might just be for non-active, but here we are. We also don't know what kind of REMS, sort of the risk monitoring system or black box we might have with the liver toxicity issue. But I want to talk through these key ideas here, these key issues, because before long, a whole bunch of payers in this country are going to have to write down a policy about who gets access. And I'm going to start with the clinical experts here, because the big question for me is how are we going to know the right patients to think about for this drug among the SPMS community? So Rob, let's start with you. So it's September 29th. It got approved the day before. It's magically in the wholesalers. It's in the pharmacy. Let's just pretend. And you want to prescribe this. You have an SPMS patient in your office. What are you thinking about in terms of the ideal patient for this therapy?
Yeah, no, it's an easy question. No, it's
Oh,
really
great.
hard, really hard question.
I know.
It's the question that everybody, I think, wishes they knew the answer to,
Yeah.
on the patient selection piece. I think I personally have a tendency to align the availability of a new mechanism of action with the unmet need. That is, the people who are progressing, typically year over year. Maybe every 2 years you could tell some difference, um, without any actionable disease activity. Many of them are already on a highly effective disease modifying therapy like a B cell depleting therapy, and are continuing to worsen despite that, and will ask the question, should I switch to something different? I think putting bounds on it in terms of age is going to be really difficult, because this is not just older individuals. I have younger individuals with progressive MS that exhibit this phenomenon as well. I think it would be feasible to say you need to have some demonstration of the person worsening, like, in other words, they're not stable, that they're worsening. But other than that, besides having the diagnosis of MS and having some evidence of clinical worsening, I struggle to figure out exactly how to put bounds around this, and guidelines.
Thank you, Rob. Ellen, something that you said earlier today in our conversation, because that I wanted to touch on, is one of the things that often happens with a new therapy when we don't know, right, the right population, is we might look to the trial inclusion criteria to say that's going to be the best representation. But I think you made the point that the trial inclusion criteria weren't necessarily indicative of a typical SPMS population. And so with that in mind, anything you'd like to add to what Rob said about how we know exactly which patients would be right for this therapy if it gets approved?
Well, I mean, one thing I've noticed for myself and for colleagues is that it's very hard to watch people get worse. It probably our suffering as clinicians is secondary, but we develop very long and lasting relationships with the people we serve. And it is really heartbreaking to see people get worse and to realize there aren't treatments that are really helping them. And there can be a tendency, therefore, to say, okay, we'll just throw the kitchen sink, and not be very thoughtful and being realistic with people about you know, what does a time to event difference mean? And do these results apply to you or not? And what are the expectations of this therapy, like Nancy was alluding to? Is it going to, you know, guarantee that I don't get worse, or is it going to slow my worsening, and over what period of time? So I think when I think about this, I not only think about, like, do the results of the trial apply to the person in front of me, but how am I trying to translate what I know and my interpretation of the data, and feeling all the things I feel, and surely thinking about the person in front of me and their loved one and all that we want to happen for them, but how to do so, you know, safely, and to not make decisions that, you know, might not be that helpful, especially when we don't really have a good way of knowing if it's working or not
Thank you,
at the
Ellen.
individual level.
Yeah. Jeff and Erin, I want to turn to you because you've already heard Kathy have deep empathy for the challenge that we will be faced by looking at this data set and trying to design a coverage policy. And without all the data that we would love to have to make the best decision. Erin, let me start with you. What are you looking at in sort of the data set as you try to connect that to a coverage policy? Is it clinical trial inclusion criteria? Is it non-active only? Like, tell me a little bit about how this is starting to form in your head for a potential coverage policy.
Sure. I think, you know, the biggest thing to review is, just like we do with any new drug, would be, okay, this is an unmet need. This is a new drug in that space to treat, you know, part of the disease that doesn't have any treatments. So, you know, obviously that's going to be the first consideration. I think we're looking to make sure we get the right patients. You know, we're going to look to the clinicians as far as what to include. I mean, I think what the FDA labels it for is going to be, you know, a big part of it. Is it just which type of SPS is it going to be? Is it active or just non-active? So I think that will be, you know, some telling there. But I think that, you know, it's a drug that's in a new space to treat this disease. You know, there's concerns with the liver toxicity or harm there. And I think that, you know, that's going to be a big conversation between a patient and their caregiver. So, you know, discuss what the benefit of being on the drug, and then what the extent of, you know, the risks or the time to monitor, things like that. So, you know, not limiting access, getting it to the right patient, but then, like, allowing that clinician patient conversation decision.
So Jeff, to you, in terms of, you know, the sort of early thoughts about what this could look like from a coverage policy perspective, what are some of the considerations that you have in your head about making that policy decision?
Yeah, and I think Erin covered most of it. The way that we would approach this is we would look at the evidence, start with the evidence, and understand the benefits of therapy and in what population, understand the harms of therapy. We know there's a liver concern. We definitely don't want to expose patients to harm unnecessarily. Not everyone is an expert. There are, you know, 70 or so thousand prescribers across the country. Not all of them are a Dr. Motri or a Dr. Bremel. They're not all like them. So they're the experts. If the world was full of them, we would be in great shape. So it's understanding the evidence, understanding the safety concerns. Do the evidence outweigh the risks relative to other therapies? And it's all about just making sure the right patients get access to the therapy. That's really what it's about. We will also consult with independent external neurologists, similar to the expertise we have here, to get a feedback and clinical feedback on the criteria. We will also review this with an independent external committee for their, if there's agreement or alignment, so things can be modified. We will use, as I talked about, the evidence, the label, clinical practice guidelines. I'm not sure if they'll be very as helpful at this point, but ultimately come up with criteria. And that's initially, and then we will monitor on an ongoing basis. Are we seeing clinical outcomes that we expected based on the evidence that we've seen in the trials? Many times what you see in the clinical trial, which is kind of a laboratory environment, is not necessarily reflective of real world patients. We heard earlier about the heterogeneity of patient presentation and so forth. Are we seeing the outcomes we expected? We're starting to see other side effects that were not known before. So that's really generally how we would approach it.
All right, so I'm going to ask some specific questions. I am not going to put any of you on the spot, so I'm going to let any of you try and answer this. But I'm doing this because I think there are some real challenges that we probably are going to see translating the label and the clinical trial evidence to a coverage policy. And we want to do what Jeff and Aaron are saying. They want to use the evidence to tell us this. And so we've got some questions that we can ask here. Okay. Is it fair or unfair to limit the population to sort of match the clinical trial inclusion criteria? Who wants to weigh in? Lisa, I think I know your answer to all of these questions, but you're allowed to answer too.
Yeah, I mean, I can take a first
Please.
shot at that, and then people can jump in. But
Great.
but I think, you know, we designed this drug specifically for the patients that are having disability. So this is a disability targeting therapy, right? So in our Hercules trial, the big criteria to come into the trial was that you had to have disability for at least a year to come into the trial. What's interesting is that also in our Gemini trial, we also showed a 30% slowing of disability in those patients who were relapsing MS patients at the very beginning of the stage of the disease, right? So the very early stage of the disease. It's probably not fair or appropriate to target those patients because they still might be in that sort of higher relapsing kind of phase of the disease, right? But I think what that tells us is that you want to get these patients as early as possible to prevent any further disability. You don't want to wait until we have significant disability to start the drug because you're losing time and you're losing brain, right? So that's kind of where I would kind of start to frame up this argument is that, yes, we can use the clinical trial criteria for Hercules, which is, you know, disability progression over the last year in the absence of relapse activity, which kind of tells you you've kind of changed your biology in that patient. You have a more predominant smoldering biology picture, and we target that. That's where we work inside the brain. So that increases your level of confidence that you're treating the right patient. But getting that patient as early as possible in that spectrum. And I know there were some comments that the patient, you know, that's not the typical patient we see if you see those inclusion criteria, but at the end of the day, that might be the best patient that you might want to target so that you approach this from the earliest possible moment. So I'll stop there for anybody else.
Perfect. No, that's great. Alan and Rob, I'm looking at you because one thing that I sort of see from my very uneducated piece here is that progression to disability could still be happening in somebody who's having active relapses. And you might have other therapies that you would prefer to be using than this one in that population. So it's not necessarily sort of a one-to-one here that anyone who's had that progression of disability, but keep me honest because I'm new to this. Ellen, what are you thinking there?
Yeah, no, I agree. Again, you know, trying to think about the population that was included and the broader population of individuals with MS, there are a lot of contributors to why people had disability moving into a trial like this Hercules study. I really think that probably some of your patients became more disabled due to the COVID pandemic and sitting around for real, which would not be the same thing as a neurodegenerative, you know, mechanism. Some of them had active disease that you weren't measuring in the years before. And we know that because even on a one snapshot kind of thing, some of them were active at baseline. And so it's the overlap between those constructs is pretty substantial. We don't know when people were taken off their prior disease modifying therapies. We know when, that they had to be off, for this medication for 8 weeks and this one for longer, but that doesn't tell us actually how long ago they were treated and which of the medications when they were stopped 8 weeks later might have actually led to new lesions at the baseline MRI scan versus, those that weren't. So there's just a lot of overlap in those constructs. And I think that, in this question of, do we have to stick definitely to a trial? No, this isn't like the cancer literature where, in this precision medicine space, we have a genetic marker within somebody's own tumor, and then a therapy has been tested in people with and without that marker, and we can see that the marker tells us for sure this is your medication. We don't have that level of precision, so clinicians are always trying to interpret with their patients, how well does that, or should be trying to reflect on how well does the person in front of me reflect the people who are included in the trial, and especially once we see those subgroup analyses, where do they best fit in? Because people might be 62, and that person is more like a 60-year-old than an 80-year-old, but they're still outside that window. Maybe they don't have relapses though, and so we'll have to look at those subgroup data and do our best.
I think that my expectation that I could ask a few yes or no questions and get some clarity was probably a little bold that's possible with this, just given the complexity of this, the tricky with diagnosing, like interpreting the data and all of those things. So one thing that occurs to me in this conversation, and Jeff, I think you made this point. So if I ever have this happen to me, I want either Ellen or Rob to be my doctor. And so let's talk about is the flexibility that we need to have in a coverage policy so that physicians can be using their judgment and in concert with what the patients are telling them about their progression. Should we trade that off with, should we limit prescribing to MS specialists, not just neurologists? And that comes with equity issues. I'm going to throw that out right there. So maybe there's a consultation piece. But Jeff and Aaron, can you talk a little bit about how does that land as a way that we can get this sort of maybe a broader label, a little less utilization management potentially, but in trade-off is it's really got to be an Ellen or a Rob. Jeff, how do you think about that kind of trade-off?
We do that rarely, just to be honest.
That's great. That's what I want to hear. Okay, so that's rarely a thing. Yep.
Because there's practical. It's nice if we wouldn't require prescribed by a neurologist. It would be either prescribed by or in consultation with. But then there's the real world practical issues of timing and delay in access, and they're busy. Dr. Morby and Dr. Morby haven't shared this, but I know they're extremely busy, and their patient workload is very high. So we'll do it rarely. We did it for hepatitis C, for example, early on. We did it with Alzheimer's, as you probably recall, Sarah. So it's rare. I don't know if we would do that here necessarily, unless it's unless we feel it's really, really critically important to have that specialist.
I'm definitely comfortable being wrong on this. I don't mind that my ideas get shot down as we have this conversation. Aaron, I'm going to have your reaction to this too. I will throw in another piece here, which is that safety issue that I think we want to talk a little bit more about too, with the sort of requirement for liver monitoring, and that again, I think I'd feel better if it was Ellen and Rob who were managing that given their expertise. But Aaron, that trade-off, maybe a little less but a prescriber restriction, how does that feel to you?
Yeah, no, I agree with what Jeff said. And I think it's a tough balance. I think ideally, we would want every patient to be seen by an Ellen or a Rob. I mean, and then, that was just, I think the discussion of inequity would just build on there. But, access to the medication, who the patient can see where they live or who they have access to, and we don't want to hinder that from them. So I mean, not saying yes or no, but I mean, obviously, I think that it could be a consideration, but then like you said, like there's the inequity piece too. But ideally, everybody, it would be great if everybody could be seen in an MS center by an MS specialist.
Right. Okay. Aaron, thank you.
Yep.
All right. Just a couple more things on coverage policy, and then we're going to shift to future research needs. This is your 25-minute warning. No, less than that, that you're about to get your chance to like call on someone to do something to sort of fix this. And that's going to be in just a few minutes. Step therapy comes up a lot when we think about treatment for relapsing forms of MS, because there's a lot of different therapies out there. We might have policies that try to incentivize the use of the most cost-effective therapy. My read of the room here doesn't make a lot of sense here because there's nothing approved for this population. Does anyone want to argue with that perspective? No one's taking my bait so far. Okay, great. No one's taking my bait. Love it. The other one I wanted to throw out is, with full acknowledgement that cost sharing is ultimately a benefit design decision that is not necessarily made by the payer, but is often made by the purchaser of the plan. Think a big employer or a labor union or a big state. Cost sharing when there's no other approved therapies starts to bend my brain as a thing, right? Cost sharing is meant to incentivize the use of other therapies when they're available. Anyone want to make a play for why there should be cost sharing for this therapy when it comes out? Jeff and Aaron are not taking my bait as I do this, which I completely understand. I just think that it's just worth noting where we are with this cost sharing journey. Even some of the economists who talked about having skin in the game was how we were going to have more affordable healthcare and health insurance are starting to retract that idea. So we might put something in there about thinking twice about cost sharing when there's no alternative therapy.
I mean, Sarah, it's a tough thing when you talk about preventative therapies in a chronic disease, because the value that any individual receives in a given month when they're paying the bill, they don't necessarily accrue that benefit that same month, coincident with it. They're accruing maybe some long-term benefit. And
Right.
so patients often don't feel as much benefit in the moment. This is not a medication that's going to make anybody feel better.
Better the next day. Right. Right. Yeah.
And in the MS world, I think there are some perverse economics that happen as well, to be honest, with
I agree.
cost sharing that's borne by manufacturers and nonprofit foundations and things like that, that sort of the calculus doesn't always work as purely as we would like.
And I talk to a lot of employers and purchasers who are struggling with the increasing cost of health insurance. And one of the ways that their premiums don't go up for them and for their employees as much is more cost sharing. Doesn't feel good, but it's one of the ways that we manage that. I do think that we can be more as a community, going back to what Ellen was saying earlier about like bringing our best human selves. I think we can think twice about asking people with chronic conditions to subsidize the cost of health insurance for healthy people, because that's literally the opposite of what health insurance is supposed to be. So I want to talk about Medicare coverage quickly, and this is where I need your advice. This idea of patients transitioning from commercial to Medicare coverage seems rather acute for this population given the age. And that being, whether they're on a DMT that we use for relapsing forms and it's working for them, or what we might see in terms of Medicare coverage for this particular therapy, because it's not part of a protected class. And so plans will be making their own choices about this. Do you have any things that you wish CMS had in their heads about this therapy, and especially about therapies for this condition, SPMS, that you would like us to highlight? Kathy, can I start with you? I think that your community has been thinking hard about this issue.
Yeah, for sure. And I think CMS needs to think about, of course, that unmet need, that there isn't another therapy in this class.
Right.
Having said that, a lot of these people will actually be on Medicare, not transitioning, but they may already be on
right,
Medicare,
yep.
which increases the cost. It really can increase the cost and the burden on the government to pay. And so I think a lot of this will be driven by, how much is the drug going to cost, and what negotiating ability will this particular drug get at some point. But I think unmet need is important. I also think too, and I wanted to say this earlier, when we look at clinical trial results and even the data that we still want to see, we're looking at group data. Yet
Right.
when Ellen or Rob or any of the other providers are sitting in their clinic, they're not talking to a group of 1,000 people. They're talking to one. And then that's where that flexibility needs to be, right? And so now you're trying as a provider to figure out if this person's MS might benefit by a particular therapy, right? And you're also trying to listen to that person's risk tolerance, their ability to pay, the issues that they're having, their goals, their values. All these things go into this one person's decision making. And so I
Yeah.
think that flexibility is needed because you're not looking at that entire group. And so it's not going to follow this potentially the specifics of the label. You're obviously looking at that population, but there's going to be nuances that we have to manage. So for CMS, I think it's the unmet need. It's going to be the cost of it. Or are they going to be able to negotiate? What will the cost be? Is it going to be $115,000, or is it going to be less than that and thus potentially more affordable? So I think that those are important aspects of how they handle this.
Anyone else have a call to action to CMS? So we think about the Medicare coverage piece here. That was very well stated by Kathy. Wonderful. All right, we're going to shift to future research needs. This is an area of our policy recommendations that we try to not just be sad that we don't have all the data that we want. Let's talk about how we get it, or what would we need to see in order to be making better decisions so that everyone's job is a little easier here. I'm going to start with part of the research I do leading up to every policy roundtable moderation as I go and I look at the most recent guidelines to see sort of what's happening. And I think they were last updated in 2018. So I was going to throw out that we should be calling on the clinical societies to be updating their guidelines with a specific focus on SPMS and the treatment pathway there. Anyone want to disagree with me? Ellen, please.
I'm not disagreeing. I just think we always have to be careful because the guidelines that we try to work on are still guided by expert consensus, which is one of the, lower levels of evidence in terms of thinking about that. And they get outdated very quickly because we are fortunate to have partners in industry and academia who are really dedicated to making some inroads. And so, I always talk with my newly diagnosed folks about every year, we have new medications that are coming out, right? And so, the evidence shifts quickly. So maybe not just guidelines, but like a pathway to quickly update them and recognize that even the best guidelines are going to have limitations, gaps, and become sort of out of date.
Love that addition to the yes, we need them updated. We also need a way to quickly update them so that we're not thinking about this as one sort of static thing. The other thing that I noted was diagnostic criteria. We heard a lot today about the difficulty of diagnosing in this condition, how it's a retroactive diagnosis. What would we want from the research community to make diagnosis easier?
Well,
Rob.
I think initial diagnosis of MS is thankfully moving toward more of a biologically based diagnosis rather than an expert diagnosis, more reliant on objective testing such as imaging, including specialized imaging and spinal fluid analysis. So that's an improvement in terms of identifying this particular entity, like a non-active secondary progressive MS, or when has somebody entered into a phase where they might benefit from a treatment like this or treatment with this mechanism. I don't think we're there yet. I would love biomarkers that would predict a response to therapy and help us to select patients. You could think of something like, for instance, a phase rim lesions on MRI scan as potentially being an interesting area to look into, and whether presence of those would select someone as a potential responder. And I think it's fertile territory potentially for subgroup analyses or for additional studies. But I would put biomarkers of response to therapy high on my list.
Fantastic. Ellen, please.
Yeah, I think, applying novel ways of monitoring people from inception when they're kind of in that early phase, when we're not really measuring disability worsening, would be great. How can we help monitor people above and beyond these, very specialized neurologic exams getting put onto this scale that is required right now for outcome measures? And then tracking a large number of people collaboratively and at scale would be really helpful, because I know have some early data suggesting we can see some within person changes that portend later atrophy and disability worsening. And I'm not claiming our results are the end all and be all, but I really think if we could align as a community to do some of this work, we might be able to identify those folks. And then honestly, as Nancy was alluding to, it would be nice to figure out the therapies that could then insert before a huge amount of clinical manifestations have occurred. When people tell you like, oh, I think I'm getting worse, to drop in a medication that prevents disability worsening without having to wait the 3 to 5 years to confirm, yes, they've had 2 EDSS, exams in a row that are worse than the year before. To me, that would be great. And maybe that involves developing better patient-reported outcomes as well, that incorporate the voice of the person with MS and the people around them who sometimes can see those same kind of things happening.
You brought me beautifully to the next point that I was going to try to go to both Nancy and Kathy on, which is, in a lot of the reviews that ICER has done over the years and our partnership with patients and patient groups, we hear, the outcomes that matter to me were actually nowhere in this clinical trial. I know, and we talked a lot about it today, about the data that we would love to see about some of the other measures of disability, not just the EDSS and its sort of focus only on mobility, the fatigue, the cognitive, the other aspects. We talked about wanting more on the caregiver related outcomes, and so that we can be measuring that. Nancy and Kathy, let me give you a moment to say what's your wish list on the patient reported outcomes piece for future research. Nancy, you want to go first? So please, Kathy. No. Yeah, no. Nancy, would you like to go first? No, she does. Kathy, she's pointing it to you.
So there's a few things I agree. I'm just going to back up a little bit. We certainly criticize the EDSS. We've been criticizing it for as long as I've been in the MS space, which I can tell you is longer than anybody here. And yet here it is. It's still here. We're still looking at it. And it's just been a remarkable challenge to try and come up with a clinical measure, an objective measure, if you will. And it's not really that objective, that gives us really good answers. So a biomarker, just as we're moving to a biological diagnosis, I think that we obviously need something that's much more objective in order to measure worsening over time. And in terms of what people want, it's looking at what's important, right? And so it's those functional outcomes that people have. And I would honestly say at the end of the day, while mobility is critically important for people, I might argue that the fact that we don't have a measurement for in a clinical trial as a primary outcome relative to cognition is a huge miss. Because I would say that for me, and when I think, and I do think about this, if I was impaired or challenged with my walking, for example, but I had 100% of my cognitive ability, I would still be a participant in my life. But if I lose a significant amount of my cognitive ability, I'm no longer a full participant in my life. And so I would say we need a cognitive measure as part of clinical trials. But I think if we're going to start looking at worsening, that has to be looked at in my mind, as a primary endpoint. We're missing the boat on a very important aspect of someone's life.
Thank you, Kathy. Nancy, anything you'd like to add on the outcomes that matter most to you that you want to see in future research?
Well, I do like what Kathy started down the right road with that there are huge misses in what counts. But I think one of the things early on when you get diagnosed with MS is the first thing, at least back in back when I was diagnosed and I was told I needed to get my affairs in order over 30 years ago and that I should quit my job and stop everything because I wouldn't be around very long. Boy, are they in
We're so glad they were wrong, Nancy. Please keep going.
such a surprise, right? But so we've moved in a good direction, but I think there's so many holistic components that we know about that impact quality of life for people. Um, you know, my clinical outcomes are going to be dependent on not just the drug I take, but do I have access to healthy food? Do I have people helping me? Am I stressed out about how I'm paying rent or a mortgage? I think some of those pieces that we don't always think about, if you have a chronic illness, those are things that are on your mind all the time. So you can't compare apples to apples because everybody improved in walking or everybody's walking didn't get worse or uh, everybody can still, I don't know, lace up their shoes because there's so many other factors that impact that. Do you have an emotional support system? I think that some of these questions have to be added in when we're looking at, is this effective? Because I think you'll find that if for the people for whom certain things are in place, it'll be real effective. And for the people who are missing some things, we're going to find it doesn't work. It
Nancy,
doesn't
thanks.
matter how good the drug is, right?
Right. It doesn't matter how good the drug is if you have extreme anxiety over whether or not you can pay your rent. Right. I mean, it's like there's just pieces here that are all interconnected. You articulated that beautifully. Thank you so much. Almost time for your final call to action. So any other research requests, needs that we want to hear? Okay, Ellen, you got another one. Go.
One thing, when we look at trying to learn from real world experience, that we've noticed when we started to try to compare the effectiveness for approved medications on various outcomes is a major limitation is that we actually don't collect the indications for which medications are used or stop. And this concept of confounding by indication, the reason that you are prescribed tolobrutinib, the reason you are given an anti-CD20 therapy or not offered treatment is related to the outcomes of interest. So if there were ways to systematize, the way that we monitor and ask people about, well, why are you choosing, I don't know, anti-CD20 therapy at this time or whatever, we might be able to do a better job and learn more about those real world indications, and how they're working for subpopulations who weren't included in clinical trials, for example, and try to return some of that evidence to the next wave of people who are going to be faced with the same decisions.
Thank you. All right. Lisa, you get to go first in terms of something that you would ask of someone in the ecosystem that you would like to see changed or improved. We sometimes make a joke that it can be one sentence with one semicolon, but I'm not going to count the number of semicolons. But as we wrap up today, what is your call to action for somebody in the ecosystem?
Yeah, I mean, I'll try to keep it short, but as we've gone through this process and developed this drug for disability and really kind of dove into some of these processes, I think the one call to action I would say is that I'd want for physicians, healthcare providers to start to look for that disability in their patients and acknowledge it. And they may not be candidates for drug treatment, right? They may be candidates for rehab or other things that are going to improve their lives at that point. But I think we're at a point now in the disease state where we really need to start targeting the disability and really recognizing that disability early in the patients and be able to intervene on it.
Thank you, Lisa. Aaron, to you. Do you have a call to action for someone in the ecosystem to make all of this a little bit easier?
Yeah, I don't think I have a specific call to action to any one person, but I think that like just reflecting on everything that was said today, it's going to be a group effort, to make sure that we have an affordable drug that's evidence-based, while keeping the member and caregivers, the center of all that, and supporting, the physicians. I think that, this is not a call on one of us. I think it's a call on all of us.
Thank you, Aaron. Jeff.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief. I just remember many years ago, we had Avonex, Betaseron, Copaxone, and Rebif way back in the day. And it's amazing how many therapies we have right now. So just want to call out our pharmaceutical company colleagues that have put the resource into the discovery to change really the landscape of MS. It's very different nowadays. So my I guess, wish list, still in this thing in the drug company theme, is to continue conducting high quality research that has the right outcomes and endpoints in the clinical trial, and not to forget about the quality of life aspect of it, the member perspective, including quality of life instruments in the clinical trial, and both disease specific instruments and general instruments like SF36, EQ5D, and so forth, but like MSQLI, the multiple sclerosis disease specific questionnaire, so that all those outcomes are there. This is idealistic, by the way. I'm not saying everyone should go out and do this, but idealistic. And then have the drugs priced in a way that helps with the affordability, because the affordability helps access for everybody. Easier said than done, but that would be my wish.
That's great. Thank you. Ellen.
Yeah, just to try to take a slightly different tack, regardless of the outcomes for this particular program, I just think it's important to remember that the lessons we're learning, what we're learning about treatment targets, are going to make the advances. They're going to take us through the next phase. And I think that they have major implications, not only for people with MS, but also for people with other aging related neurodegenerative diseases of the nervous system. So I'm a really big fan of trying to open up the dialogue between people with different scientific backgrounds, between patient groups, between other perspectives, to try to learn together and to really foster the kinds of conversations that are going on now, so we can be transparent together about what we know and understand, and where the gaps in knowledge still are that would sort of lend themselves well to the next set of scientific inquiries.
Thank you. Rob.
Yeah, I think we all have a role to play. Honestly, there's not a group represented here that doesn't have a lot of work to do. There is a huge unmet need. The physicians and researchers on the call can certainly contribute by evolving the knowledge, evolving, the monitoring and the diagnostic criteria. I'll commit to doing everything I can do to try to do my part. I think we would expect in return that, everyone on the call tries to work toward access to therapies for patients with MS who live in this world of uncertainty, right? We wish we had perfect information and a cure, but for right now, they're living day to day with this disease. And I think access to both neurological care and medications that might potentially help them are something that they would all ask for. And I think we all have probably an obligation to try to work towards more affordability for these as well, recognizing the challenges that the manufacturers who invest an absolute ton in developing these therapies bear, the burden that they bear, the burden that the payers bear, trying to balance all these things, the employers that pay for these plans, the patients that bear the cost of these plans, and of course government entities as well. So we have to work together to do it, but hopefully, we bring the best people to the table in a positive attitude and can move forward together.
Thank you, Rob. Kathy.
Jeff mentioned the ABCR drugs from long ago. And when those drugs were approved, particularly the first 3, there was about a 30% reduction in relapses. And in fact, one was argued for years of having an 18% reduction in relapses. And yet we thought that we had really made a major breakthrough, which we had. For the first time, we changed the natural history of MS. Since then, our ability to combat acute inflammation and the relapses that are associated with it have improved substantially, dramatically, such that many people don't even know what a relapse is, because other than the symptom that got them approved, they haven't had anything else happen for years. So I think we have to consider where we are in treating progressive MS, particularly where we're looking at, which is progression without this inflammatory activity, right? So we are quite possibly at the cusp, at the beginning of this. And we have found that in the MS space, we build the plane while we're flying it. So we have treatments and we come up with treatments, yet we're still flying the plane, right? We don't know everything there is, but we're churning out treatments that we think work and we believe work, and they do to some extent. And I think that in the world of progressive MS, we're definitely building the plane and flying it at the same time. And I think we have to keep that in mind, that that's part of the science here in MS, which gives me my semicolon. Now we have to look at our clinical trials, and are they actually measuring what we need them to measure? I would say not completely. Certainly MRI has improved our clinical trial outcomes enormously, but our clinical outcomes maybe not so much. They're much more challenging and much more subjective. The more biological outcomes that we can get, the better, but I would also argue the more patient-reported outcomes, and considering them as part of the success or the efficacy, if you will, of a drug is also important. And you already know how I feel about cognition. And final semicolon, once we have these treatments, then it becomes educational, right? We're educating on what does MS do over time. We're still learning that, right? And we'll probably have brand new criteria that will come out in the next year or so. So education for people who live with the disease, but also for healthcare providers. Not everyone's going to go to an MS center. There are about 1 million people with MS in the United States. 50% right now at least receive their care in the community. I don't think Ellen or Rob are willing to take on that 50%. And there's just not enough expertise as far as MS centers. So I think that it becomes incumbent upon all of us, and I would argue that a lot in the patient advocacy world, to make sure that people with MS, their families, and also providers are well educated as we move this building of the plane along.
Kathy, thank you for your creative use of semicolons. It made my heart happy. Nancy, you get the final word today. A call to action.
Oh, geez. I'm thrilled that secondary progressive MS is actually getting noticed, and that in the greater scheme of things, that people have finally realized that maybe us older folks have a quality of life worth contributing to society. So that gives me some hope. Otherwise, you wouldn't be spending time trying to find something to make my life better, right? Also, that we're looking at things other than just the same mechanisms that are used for relapsing, remitting MS drugs, because as we get older, things that wipe out half of our immune system probably aren't a good thing. My neurologist, we've already had that conversation. No, you can't try that drug. That's not going to help you. So I'm grateful for that. I think the most important thing, whether doing research or seeing patients in clinic, or as far as even deciding what payment decisions will be, listen to the patients, listen to what we have to say for everybody. I think that's the most important thing, because there's a grain of truth, no matter how it comes across, whether we're not feeling good and we're cranky and we're angry or crying or whatever, there's a grain of truth in what we're saying. And you can come up with all the great plans to help us, but if you don't listen to our input, it won't make a difference. That's it.
No chance I could have said that any better. Nancy, thank you. And thank you to all of you. My call to action is that we can be continuing to emulate good behavior when it comes to having difficult conversations But figuring out how to navigate it together, which is what you all demonstrated today by showing up and being part of this conversation, especially to Nancy, Kathy, Ellen, and Rob for being with us the entire day, so that we are hearing the voices we need to hear as we think about ensuring affordable access to a new medicine like this. So deep gratitude to you all for being with us today. With that, I am turning things back over to Ralph, who will lead us through some final reflections from our CTAF members. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Sarah, and everybody on the roundtable. What an incredible discussion. So rich with knowledge and also suggestions for the future. At this time, we're going to have reflections from CTAF, from my colleagues, who will see if we can add on to some of those incredible comments. So, Bob, you know I'm going to use you first. Bob Collier.
I really ought to get used to this with you. I appreciate the discussion. I'm glad to hear so much talk about actually using clinical trials and trying to get really serious about it. In order to keep my usual semi-diatribe awfully short this time, it's clear to me that BTKIs are not the great hope for the future here, much less maybe anywhere else. Sorry about that. And once again, we've got a disease that I really, really wish we'd have a lot more focus on getting in front of and finding out what it really is instead of chasing the tail all the time with yet another drug that we're trying to throw at and see if what happens.
Thanks, Bob. Paul Heidenreich.
Yeah, I'll say if we're going to rely on a single trial to conclude a therapy is beneficial, a positive primary outcome is required but insufficient. We need to see either a very large quality of life benefit that overwhelms any safety signal, which I don't think was the case here, or a mortality benefit.
Thanks, Paul. Jeffrey.
I had a haiku and a single sentence answer. The haiku, data everywhere and not enough to think. Now, this is a good one to fund. The single sentence would be, the cost effectiveness analysis helped us understand what we know and what we don't as we consider how to help patients and their loved ones by investing in options with demonstrated value.
I should save you for last, Jeffrey. Jeff.
Yeah, so as I'm thinking about this, when I started treating MS patients, 35 years ago, we had no treatment. And I lived through the beginning drugs, the ABC drugs, which at the time were about $12,000. We actually thought, oh my gosh, that's so unaffordable. How can we do that? We had panels to decide who was appropriate. Then the costs went up from there. But I have to say it's been an amazing journey because we went from drugs that sort of had some efficacy, but a fair number of side effects and hassles to a place now where the drugs are highly effective and actually really pretty well tolerated. So it's been a major transformation. And I don't think anybody should be discouraged with the vote on this medication. I just don't think we have the data. But the idea that we are looking into a new mechanism of action and addressing this huge unmet need with secondary progressive MS, I think everybody should look positively on that because I think we may be at the cusp of a transformation the way we've seen with MS in general. So I'm actually quite encouraged, just in this space, even though the vote came out negative, that's just related to we don't have enough information, but I'm super enthusiastic. So that's my take.
Thanks, Jeff. Annetta.
There we go. So listening to the discussion, so just thank you, everyone. I mean, it's been really, really helpful to hear the different perspectives, especially, especially Kathy and Anyways, it's been super helpful, but I have another thought. So, Jeff alluded to, I was a resident when beta seron was FDA approved, and it almost didn't get approved because relapses are subjective. And it went through because it demonstrated a difference on an objective measure. We're not in that situation right now with this drug. And I am very worried that we may actually follow the Alzheimer's path, where we're talking about a novel mechanism of action. But if this drug becomes widely used in inactive SPMS, or that it's going to stall out real advances in secondary progressive treatments, because that will then become the standard of care. Everything must be measured against it. It's going to cost over $100,000 a year. And I think we can't dismiss how greedy the MS pharma market is. Those drugs that came out over 30 years ago, the evidence has mounted that they're even less effective than we thought they were, and yet they are now about $100,000 a year. So I think we have to be a little bit careful when we get excited about a new mechanism of action, when the real effect is tiny, 8% on the primary different outcome only. And as our patient advocate pointed out, no reversal of disability, which is what our patients are really looking for. And if that's what we want for inactive SPMS, we need to keep looking. This BTK inhibitor is not the answer.
Thank you for your perspective. Sai.
A couple things that kind of I was struck by was, number one, I really appreciated Sanofi's interactions and engagement with us. I think it really helps to get a sense from the manufacturer's perspective. I also really appreciated the patient perspectives that Nancy brought. Especially I loved Sarah's pointing out how it was an important milestone when patients were sympathetic to the payer's dilemma, and recognizing that all of us are, number one, first and foremost focused on patients' perspectives, but all of us come with a slightly different perspectives. Manufacturers are publicly traded companies, and they have a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders. I am an academic, and so I have my own biases. And so all of us, recognizing that all of us come at this with a slightly different perspective, but we get to a better answers when all of us are at the same table and engaged in the discussion. So the final thing that I was thinking was actually, and that is, I really appreciated her expertise on this, as well as our clinical experts. But I was thinking, I was a little more optimistic about the analogy with the Alzheimer's medications, in that the first one that was approved and came up, aducanumab, I think everyone recognizes now it is not a great drug. And subsequent drugs are still not great, but maybe slightly more promising. And I do think that I really liked Jeff's comment about this is actually, maybe the first one is not the one that's going to hit it out of the park. But the fact that we're focusing on this clearly under-treated, under-recognized, under-studied disease, even if this is not the one that really transforms care, that this is actually an important, we learn a lot from each, I guess failure may be a terrible word, but each one that isn't perfect. But I think we are learning a lot, and I'm so, overall, I'm filled with a lot of optimism for where we are.
Sai, thanks for your thoughts and all those semicolons. Joy.
First off, I want to thank the people who have participated today, especially the panelists and the even more so the patient representatives, for helping to expand my view on this whole issue. And as I was listening to the policy roundtable, I felt the need to sort of back up to a much higher level and put this whole discussion into context. So hearing people calling for the importance of more clinical trials and clinical trials that enroll diverse populations and the challenges of coverage and co-pays, it brought to my mind the current budget bill, which is now before the Senate. And that bill cuts from NIH 40% of the NIH budget. And it will, if passed as its current in its current form, will eliminate millions of people from insurance coverage. And I'm sure that some of them will have MS. And if this is a call to action to everyone, if we can't stop that, this discussion will not be relevant. We're going into a very different place. So sorry to be such a downer on a Friday afternoon, but I think it's really important to keep that context in mind. We get down in our technical rabbit hole, that's very important, but if we don't see the big picture, we're going to lose the whole ball game.
Well, I thought your name was Joy, but maybe it was Debbie Downer, but your comments were spot on. Lisa.
Yeah, I'll just share that I found this one particularly difficult, and similar to what Jeff was saying, I think the lopsided voting isn't necessarily indicative of how strong people's feelings may have been, because I think there is definitely the potential that these could be successful if we had, were more promising if we had the data, especially on the subgroups. And so, yeah, I like I said, I just very much struggled with it. And as was noted, more data always makes it easier to make these decisions. And I'll just note that I put a reminder in my calendar for September. I'm not a neurologist, so I don't follow the literature that well, but I will look to see what data gets presented at that meeting in September. I look forward to seeing if it helps us think about it.
Thanks, Lisa. Catherine.
Yes, thanks everybody. The roundtable really brought up some really important points. So let me reiterate one. The need for data, evidence, and open science. And I understand there are a bunch of reasons why we have embargoes, why data is not released. I get it. But we are in an era of open science. The new administration is really pushing open science and transparency. So that we're moving away from the ability to hold data. So hopefully in the future, everybody will be able to release data because we need it.
Thanks, Catherine. Rita.
Well, I'll follow on from a lot of great comments, but Catherine's most particular because, I mean, I thought this was a very educational panel. I appreciate everyone's perspectives. The patients and experts really, I always learn a lot from, and these I thought were particularly helpful today. And Grace did a great job with the evidence. But I appreciate Sanofi came, but they didn't, I mean, I didn't actually, maybe others did. I didn't learn anything from what Sanofi said. He basically said, yeah, we have the data, we're not sharing it. We have the data, we're not sharing it. We have the data, we're not sharing it. And I don't know, obviously, that's their choice on when to release the data at what meetings and timing, but we don't have the data. So, you know, I thought it was frankly an overly generous assessment to say it could, we gave it promising because it could be good. Well, it could also be deadly. I mean, it could be like aducanumab, and as others have said. So I thought it was an important discussion, but I agree that we need to get out of the era where industry has the data and selectively releases it, and we then, because once we do approve, there's no going back. You know, aducanumab was a very unusual case, and the other ones have, which I think haven't shown a much higher evidence standard, are on the market now at very high prices. And so it's really important at this stage before FDA approval and coverage that we really talk about risks and benefits and don't let companies hide behind, you know, they're going to release the data next year when it doesn't matter.
Thanks, Rita. Joanna.
And
So-
love that you channeled me, Ralph. Thank you.
Oh,
Still just made my day. All good.
I think for me, the day was the word that keeps coming to my mind is tantalizing, because I feel like there's a lot we don't know about this drug. We couldn't get the data, but we had some really eloquent presentations from Ellen and Rob and Nancy and Kathy and all of you. And I'm left on the hopeful end of, okay, if we're looking at a drug with a new kind of action, but we don't really understand it and we don't see a lot of changes yet, but it's out there, that's tantalizing to me because it shows a way forward. So I end up, having gone back and forth all day long on this, being more hopeful.
thanks, Joanna. Tony.
Yes, thank you everyone for a very informative meeting. It's really great to see all the energy and expertise going into fighting MS. My closing thought is sort of one on process. I found the voting session today and the discussions before each vote to be really helpful. So helpful that in 2 of the 5 questions, I actually changed my mind as to how I was going to vote after listening to the other panelists and experts' comments. In other words, the process works. Thank you.
Well, thanks for that comment, Tony. So my last comment as chair is, again, SPMS is a disease with a substantial unmet need, and we have to acknowledge this is a first-in-class therapy for a potential advancement for a disease that has great need. I view it as a potential new tool for the toolbox of the clinicians treating patients with MS. And I certainly hope with future data and future research will lead to greater confidence as to the drug's efficacy. I do want to thank ICER for their excellent review for today's meeting, which set up the stage for all of our discussions today, and also with the superb participation of our patient representatives, our medical experts, in broadening our understanding. And I do want to acknowledge the presence of our Sanofi representatives for their contribution and for their company's work in its efforts to improve the management of SPMS. But I also want to give my gratitude to all of my CTAF colleagues for their thoughtful discussion today, and I hope that it helps ICER in their final report. And with that, Sarah, did you want a final word?
I would love one. Ralph, thank you for a masterful job of running the meeting today and moderating the voting questions, and to all of the CTAF members and all of the meeting participants. Just a quick word on next steps. We're going to post the recording of today's meeting to our website next week. The final report, which will reflect a description of the votes, the deliberation, the policy roundtable themes, should go up around July 15th. And the link is available there to try and, if you need to find and when you want to find that information. So with that, it is my pleasure to conclude today's meeting with deep gratitude for everyone's participation and attention. And I hope everyone has a really great weekend.